Once again, I'm back in the game of new industry, building a brand, moving fast, co-founded Love Film. Amazon turned that into what today is Prime Video. I became first Chief Creative Officer of Amazon.
I'm going to sum that up as creative genius over a long period of time.
If I look back on all of the good things that have happened to me, a lot of it is because I can see I had that hyper focus on that ADHD mind.
When you talked about your ADHD diagnosis, lights coming on, bulbs going, there's a validation of why it's been so difficult to get to where I am.
I lost everything. I lost my family, lost anything I'd achieved. Yeah, I was in a really bad way. You know, I was forced to look at myself.
If we keep it as an under the carpet thing, I can't and won't talk about it, people are never going to be able to tackle their vulnerability as strongly as you now can.
I can identify with that. There are countless people that we know that have been very successful that can look back on school years as really difficult, misunderstood, but actually super bright.
I don't want your cash, I want your influence to make a difference, because we can make a difference if we get influence. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Properly looking forward to having a conversation with you.
Yeah.
Mainly because when we first met, you took my breath away with your story. And then as I was listening to you talk to a crowded room about your life, I was forming an opinion you had ADHD.
Yeah.
And then at 7/10 through the session, you sort of went, oh, and I've got ADHD. And it was a kind of, okay, we know that and we can look back. Yeah. And I thought when we were pulling this together, there's a whole story of bang and boom and success and failure and addiction and all of the troubles, and you're very graciously wanting to talk about that for the good of the people.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really strong message. So I am really looking forward to this conversation. What about you, John?
Well, I've got to know you for a good year and a half now, and I think you're a rock star. But I think it's important you probably set a bit of context in what you've done and who you are, and then let's open up the conversation.
Sure. Well, look, I come from proud South Londoner. I always talk about my granddad, who was one of my heroes, was a D-Day veteran and someone who was clearly troubled, and that had an impact on me. And we were historically, a working class family. I was probably one of the first to go on and do a degree, or I actually went to a business school, and then go and do a white collar job. I was certainly the first to go and do a job where you're paid to be a creative. And part of my story, a big part of my story is I realised in retrospect that, I was really shaped by my addictions and my, I'm not a doctor, but I think I was born an addict. And as long as I can remember, way back into childhood, I remember thinking I was different. And I remember thinking, questioning things that were all connected to my addiction. But we'll come back to that later. And so, I talked my way into this business school, European Business School, and then I straight away had a job in advertising. That first job that I did in advertising, I was an account man, which has nothing to do with finance. It just means you're really the producer. But very quickly I realized I could do the creative as well, and that's the way my mind was set up. So that I call it the twin tracks of my career were set in motion. One foot in business, entrepreneur, making, the business of creativity, and one foot in what I call the swivel-eyed loon, compulsive lateral thinking, creative side. And that's
a powerful blend, right?
At first it didn't, I think if you look back and if I look back at my career, I'd have to argue, with, and I say that with humility, it's worked for me. And I've realized over time that it's not, it's an unusual pairing. You don't always get that. And so really that was a career. It started in advertising. I worked on accounts like Unilever, accounts like Flora Margarine for your blooming generation. And I worked on Boddington's beer, the cream of Manchester, stuff like that, Signal. But I also then saw a door open, an opportunity open when a client came in. That client was Virgin, and they had this thing called Sega. And that was a moment in my life where I went, right, I'm doing that. So I left the agency to go and work for this client. And that turned into an absolute crazy 4 years of launching video games in this country. So if you remember Sonic the Hedgehog and 8-bit and 16-bit cartridges, and that was just the revolution. I think Sonic Tuesday is still one of the biggest, if not the biggest, software sales day of any video game.
Yeah.
And then I was part of two of us were headhunted to go and run the marketing at Sky. So I suddenly went from working in Virgin, Richard Branson's organization, to working for Murdoch's organization and running Sky TV, which is not the Sky TV of today. Back then, it was very aggressive, early stage. I always liked the Millwall thing, nobody likes us and we don't care. The institutions did not like the change that Sky TV represented. But I loved it. And so I did 2 years working for a legendary TV executive called Sam Chisholm. And then at the very end of that, two things had happened. I had met Chris Evans in my Sega days, and he and I were friends. And I'll never forget the day when I'd seen this woman called Popley introduce us to the internet. And just the explosion that went off, the gun that went off in my head as to what the opportunity was here. And at the same time, I met Mike Lynch of Autonomy. So I left Sky to do 2 jobs. Run Ginger Television when we did Tier 5 Friday. People of a certain age will remember this. We did Tier 5 Friday, Don't Forget Your Toothbrush. We had the Radio 1 breakfast show. So we really had our finger on the pulse of youth and popular culture.
Yeah, I remember watching them all.
Yeah.
But I was always doing, I was working for Mike Lynch on launching this search software business up in Cambridge. And eventually the time constraints, I couldn't do both, but classic ADHD person, of course I did think I could do 2. I was running between Cambridge, Palo Alto, back in time to do a show on a Friday, Saturday, absolutely crazy. And when I had to make a decision between the 2, I chose Ginger. Arguably, financially, that was a mistake, but there you go. And what I was trying to push with Chris was to evolve the digital publishing side of Ginger. That didn't happen for whatever reason. But with Chris's blessing and help, I went off, joined 2 old friends, David Tabazor and Dan Thompson, and a journalist called Danny Kelly, and we started Football 365. And, we really stuck it to the big publishing companies, all of the incumbent publishers that were just too slow to react to this revolution that was happening. So around the 365 brand, we built Football 365, Music 365, Rugby 365. And we built a publishing company around these passion centers. We generated revenue by merging with a premium phone rate company. So we were unique. We were an internet company in the early days of the revolution that was making money. We IPO'd that business in, I think, at the very end of 99. And then that was the door to a dark period in my life because...
How old are you at this point?
35-ish. And, I always talk about that was the time when there's a railway track, that's the time when the wheels came off the track for me. And maybe we'll talk about that later. But it took me a while to come back from that. And I came back from that, joined the team that created, co-founded Love Film. Fantastic, boutique investment company with a really visionary investor called Thomas Hogue. And then once again, I'm back in the game of new industry, building a brand, moving fast, making things up, really in my element of creating that brand. We built that brand up, we became market leaders, and then eventually took some investment from Amazon at the time when the physical goods, if those people watching remember, we were DVDs by post. We send, you watch, you send back, we send you another. And we definitely changed the way that high street film rental worked, which was such a business model that wasn't on the side of the consumers, late fees and all that. Poor choice, poor convenience and late fees. We changed all that. And then as we were moving fast to evolve that business into a digital business, Amazon invested in us and then eventually acquired us, took what was our streaming platform and turned that into what today is Prime Video. So I then became an Amazon employee, and a square, probably I'd say, looking back on it, a square peg in a round hole at the start, but actually not. And I loved what happened in the next 10 years. I became chief creative officer, first chief creative officer of Amazon, working with my boss, Neil Lindsay, and the great and the good. And in an environment that, I think history will show that Amazon was up there with the best ever. And being in Jeff's orbit, being in an organization where you think big, move fast, take brave moves, make decisions, bold decisions, I absolutely loved it.
It's unusual because that's a corporate environment where you were allowed to keep your entrepreneurial, creative spirit alive, right?
Yeah, well, if you look at the corporate environment, Sky at that time, very creative, very aggressive, very, very proactive. Virgin, everyone remembers. I remember a guy called Robert Devereux, Branson's brother-in-law, telling me once, when you come to Virgin, this was 1994-ish. I remember him saying to me, look, if Virgin launched a series of laundrettes, everyone in this country would immediately have a picture of what that's going to look like. It would be cheaper, better, bright lights, have MTV playing, date nights on a Thursday and subsidized washing powder. And how powerful was that brand? We knew that it was a British brand that stood for fun and challenged monopolies. So I was in that environment. So they're corporate, but I think there's corporate and I think there's corporate. And then ending up at Amazon where, moving fast, thinking big, being relentlessly focused on a consumer proposition that gives value and choice and convenience was a great home for me. And I remember Amazon saying to me, we like entrepreneurs, we like it's an entrepreneurial business. And so I they're corporate, but there's corporate and there's corporate, right?
But what I love about that is I'm going to sum that up as creative genius over a long period of time. And I know from when we first met, we met in a very high caliber business environment where you actually stood at the front of the room and were introduced with the sort of high level numbers and accreditations. And the minute that you were allowed to speak, you were very humble and kind of put your hands up. Well, that's a lovely intro, but what I'd really like to talk about is probably my greatest achievement at that time. So it was beginning of last year. I'm celebrating 22 years being clean as an addict. And I practice gratitude every day. And then I remember instantly thinking, I really want to be this guy. You're not talking about accolades. They're part of who you are, what you've done. You've ticked certain boxes that I guess you could mean a success in the society we live in. But actually, there's a guy there that's really struggled, really battled, and is still probably doing it every day. That you're coming through. And I wanted to ask you specifically about when you actually chose to go and get yourself diagnosed. Why? When you recognize certain things from an ADHD point of view, and how that's sort of almost a before and after.
Yeah, do you know what? It didn't. I think I knew. I had a sense of being and operating and thinking differently quite young. In the 70s and 80s, ADHD at school and awareness of it was very, very low. You know, occasionally, and if anything, it was definitely a pejorative. And you know what school kids are like. You talk about the bloke that's ADHD and, you know, bouncing off the walls. And but it was not in the public consciousness in the way that is awareness now. I think I knew I fixed on things, you know, sugar, exercise, OCDs, you know, things, even walking between two lampposts and holding my breath until, you know, I nearly passed out. Meant
Yeah, but
that
about crossing the zebra crossing, you've got to do it. So you've actually gone back and done it again.
I still do. I still walk across a zebra crossing, 1 foot in the black. I can't tread on the lines. It has to be equal. And if I don't do that, I'll go back over and do it. You can imagine what that looks like in the middle of London in a rush hour. People run, I'm surprised they haven't been run over. I wouldn't blame them. And then, so the thing that became apparent first, because my life fell apart, was my addiction. So alcoholism, drug use, danger, really difficult OCDs. That all came to a head at the end of 365, and you know, I lost everything. I lost my family, lost anything I'd achieved. Was I was in a really bad way, and you know, lost half my. I was down to 9 stone, you know, up for days on end, addicted to sleeping tablets, and really, really destructive behaviour. A thing happened, and I'd say that the thing that really turned me, my son had an accident, and I could actually I can still feel it now, and you know, I was forced to look at myself and get on it. He was 4 at the time, and he, you know, had a really bad accident, spent some time in hospital, and then I changed, and that was the point where I looked at where I was going, and it's almost like a Dickens, you know, Ghost of Christmas Past. This is, and I did a deal with my higher power, and I pulled the plane that was about to crash into the ground. I pulled it up and just survived. And since that day, I work on it every single day. I work on staying clean, staying sober, and I do, you know, various fellowships, and I do whatever I need to do that. And then I think at some point in my time at Amazon, I still couldn't understand how, right, I'm doing these things. I'm sober, and I'm clean, and I'm, you know, succeeding, but I still have periods of really, really, really dark depression, anxiety, fear, and I have periods of unexplainable up and unexplainable down, and it's debilitating.
And these weren't in relation to things you were doing and achieving, because it sounds like at any one time you were award winning, doing incredible things. This was all in here, right, in your head.
But it is a base state, you know. And one of the most common mistakes, and the mistake that I certainly made when I was in the throes of addiction, is thinking depression is caused by something. So if I fix that thing, then I will fix my depression. And you know, a big key learning for me is it just is. You know, I always react when people say things like, when in connection with depression, and certainly in the late, you know, last century, people would say things like, what have you got to be depressed about? Or just snap out of it. What you want to do is snap out of it. And it makes me, you know, makes me want to snap them, when people, as if it's in your gift to change this black, dark place that you're in. And of course, what I did was I tried to fix on things, people, places, things, and you know, booze and whatever else I could, and that stopped working after a while. When you put that sort of fixing behaviour into an addict, you sooner or later that's going to end badly. So I had to then put the addictive behaviour down, I still probably am a workaholic, if I'm honest. I still have got that curiosity and that drive to go and do and make things. And what I've learned is how to, you're never going to live a life free of fear, but channeling that fear. Almost every day I have to have a conversation with myself in the morning and say, your head tells you lies. My base state is that my head will start to unwind things and tell me negative things. I have to remind myself that that's not true. I have to do a little gratuity list. I have to put into whatever it is I'm doing with one of the 12-step fellowships that I'm involved in.
So these are coping mechanisms ultimately.
Yeah. Just to bring me back to that state. And then it was at some point in my time at Amazon where I thought I'd investigate the ADHD thing, because it was becoming more,
out there
and present. And so I went to see a doctor. You can find a Dr. Christos Dimitriou, I always get his name wrong, who, by strange coincidence, I'd met when I was in the treatment centre in 1999 and did my analysis and my investment. And that was, two things are funny. I remember ringing my boss, Neil, at Amazon and saying, guess what? I've had a diagnosis on ADHD. And he was like, no Sherlock. Yeah. Really? Like, if you didn't know that.
That's what you said when you...
You are like the last person in the world to know.
It's easier to look in on someone else as well. As they say, all the voices in the head, the muddle of life, right? But,
you know what? And he just said to me, look, from the second I met you, I just assumed you were. And it was so obvious, we never even talked about it. And I think the biggest thing for me about that diagnosis and the time that I spent with him was, it was another parting of the clouds.
Things made sense.
Things made sense.
I was going to ask you, what did that diagnosis give you?
It gave me a lot more clarity, a lot more understanding of the connection between depression, anxiety. There is bipolar, but that's not something that I'm really, aware of. But depression, anxiety, and addiction with ADHD are, they're almost like a boy band.
Can I pick up some of those things then?
Yeah.
When you talk about addiction, and you said earlier you think you were born an addict.
Yeah.
Of course, in everybody's day-to-day parlance, what we talk about with addiction is people think about substances. You mentioned alcohol and other substances. May touch on that in a minute. But the person with ADHD, born an addict, is actually a person who's born with ADHD.
Yeah, right.
And that then fuels addictive dopamine-seeking behaviours, which is not necessarily drug addiction. It's addiction to squirting dopamine.
Yeah.
Because that brings you to a normalized state, whatever does that. Yeah, exactly. And, if you look back in life, and the reason I'm asking this in this way is there'll be people watching this who won't be drug addicts.
No, but
maybe,
they'll be
doing other stuff. And if that addiction is harmful, then we're on the wrong pathway. If that addiction is positive, exercise is an obvious replacement for some of this stuff. And we look at a lot of triathletes who have to run 26 miles before they go to work in the morning.
Michael Phelps.
Yeah, well,
he used his
ADHD to fuel his need for exercise, which made him the world's best Olympian.
Yeah.
For you, if you look back in life, prior to those heady days of wealth, excitement, and exposure to those things that were wrong for you, what would you see was your addiction in the earlier days then, do you think?
It was anything and everything.
Yeah.
Now you say it, that made me feel different. I remember I was in the Cubs, and I remember we used to trespass on the railway, and nicking things, and we'd break into money, when I first earned money and found what that did for me. I was prolific, job, milk boy, news rounds,
anything to give you that dopamine buzz.
Those OCDs where I'd in my head told myself, if I do this will result in a better being state for myself.
You want to do it again.
I want to do it
compulsion.
again, a compulsion,
And a reward.
and a reward
And-
that I'd fabricated in my head. So that
Yeah.
so
Well,
crossing things.
Did you
So-
did you fabricated it in your head? Because if the science says that's
Exactly.
actually real,
Yeah.
you haven't fabricated it in your head. What you're doing is quite intelligently being able to articulate what was going on, whereas previously people don't and haven't been able to get that understanding. And one of the great things that can come out of this is the fact that people hearing you will actually learn how to actually understand what's going on for themselves.
100%. There's another message here. We're only sitting here because of your journey in the police to try and work out how to reduce, but ultimately crime and inmates that are perhaps not conforming within the lines.
Absolutely.
So very, very intelligent, well-meaning people are doing things that are actually illegal or offensive or not because they're not conforming to society.
Imagine if your pathway to the more unlawful addiction.
I don't need to. I mean, as part of my actions in 12-step recovery, I get to, for the last 17 years, I probably once a week go into one of London's prisons, whether it's Scrubs, Brixton, or
So you're seeing that other side.
And oh my God,
Yeah. And that could have been you, hadn't it?
That could be in a different set of circumstances.
And for 25% of our prison population, the circumstances have caught them out. Where if their ADHD had been caught earlier, as yours could have been caught earlier, we can change that trajectory. And the thing I'm strongly motivated about, and I've been for 23 years now, is we've got to get people earlier, so that we can change that trajectory. Going to see someone in prison and realizing and helping them realize the goal then is to stop them going back into prison. And the sad part about reoffending is most people who reoffend and go back into prison, they haven't reoffended. They've just broken the terms of their license, and the breaking the terms of their license is a very ADHD thing. If you're late for an appointment, you breach your license, you go back in.
Yeah.
And there's so much in your...
There is, and then the hereditary side of things. I've already said addiction, right? You know, these offenders are they almost in a spiral of repeat. So your children are.
I think there are. I was on the landing yesterday, and a prisoner said to me, I asked him about something, and he said, well, that won't happen because we're just junkie scumbags, and it broke my heart. You know, it really, really impacted me. And I think if those guys had the knowledge and the power that comes with the knowledge that I was lucky enough to find, you know, things would be different. And I'm a great believer. Why are we locking up addicts? I think if you read the Dame Carol Black report, it's something like, I'll get the figures right, 350,000 addicted people who account for 50% of crime, all the
acquisitive crime,
what have you. Fix that, and you fix that. You're not going to fix it by, building more prisons.
We're getting better at pulling people out of the stream who were drowning, but we're not working out why they've fallen in the first place. And there is another conversation for you and I think, on that 25% of the prison population. How can we help them? Because what I'm absolutely certain on, the system doesn't help them.
No.
And to go back to that hereditary piece, when I said to you earlier, well, you said it actually, of course, ADHD is hereditary. It's as hereditary as height. So I'm 6'5". My daughter is a big strapping lass. She's beautiful and tall and elegant because she's come from my genes.
Yeah.
Children of a person with ADHD, you're going to 80% chance they're going to have ADHD. So if I look at a child in clinic, we look at the parent. If we look at the parent, we look at the child, and you find these synergies all the time. You're finding people in families. Now, that's when I started in policing terms, they were the problem families, where generationally, they were on their arse because nobody was helping them with the right set of interventions. And here's your life. Half an hour doesn't do you this story justice at all.
Can I say one other thing that I think is, I agree with all of that, and I just think, to me, it's a no-brainer. I look at the people that I've got to know in the prison system, that, the prison officers, the people that are, drug strategy officers, whoever they are, they're all trying to do a great job. They're not sitting there thinking...
No, absolutely. They don't go to work day and not help people, do they?
They're trying to do the job with decreasing resources and what have you. But we just have to think differently about crime and punishment.
We absolutely do.
And how we get people back into contributing to society. One of the big things that I am convinced about in my two things there's just as the awareness thing and the information prevalence was lacking in the 70s and 80s. I'd see that there's a surge in, maybe it's my algorithm, but if I look at my Instagram, you do see a lot of things talking about ADHD. I'm wary and I'm suspicious of that. I'm certainly cautious about it, in that good in certain aspects, but also I do think some people latch onto it as an excuse. And for me, it's never been an excuse, right? It's not a reason. I don't ever use my ADHD I don't really talk about it that much. I certainly seldom mention it in meetings in a business environment. What I have learned is I think of it as my lucky break. One of the characteristics I have is hyperfocus. Mm-hmm. You could call it obsession. You could call it hyperfocus is one word. Obsession's a
hyperfocus is almost an acceptable term. Obsession and compulsion become pejorative terms, don't they?
Yeah.
The fact of life is that your ADHD will give you that capability.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you always keep that the right side? But
whether it's the fear,
obsession can get dangerous.
Yes.
Whether it's the fear and becoming a fuel, whether it's the ADHD, I don't know what it is. But when there is something that I need to do and achieve, I always tell people, if, I need to go and there's a gold bar on that thing and I need to run through a glass door, climb an 8-foot wall, run past, my hair's on fire, I will do it.
Yeah, nothing will stop.
Nothing will stop me. And so I actually think, and here's the positive, the ADHD mind that comes with a hyperfocus is a superpower. And then when I, in retrospect, on a good day, go back and I'm not feeling less than, and if I look back on all of the good things that have happened to me, a lot of it is because I can see I had that hyper focus on that ADHD mind, and that is a message I really would love to share with people. If you can don't use it as a crux, as an excuse. And I think some people do, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Work out how you can use your ADHD and your hyperfocus to, I went and did a tour of Sizewell nuclear reactor the other day. Fascinating. But, if you think of a nuclear reactor, if atomic bomb is unconstrained power, that's incredibly destructive. Confined and constrained and channeled is an unbelievable force. And I think of that. I think of my hyper focus as my nuclear reactor that can lead to behaviour that actually can achieve incredible effects.
You've now got the journey place where you are, where you're now in a position where you can look forward based on your reflections to say, yes, I can see that. There's been clearly times in that amazing life that you've had thus far, and more to come, where that hasn't been a positive channel, and it's led to weakness. It's led to behaviours that are destructive for you and for those around you. And you talk about the scale of loss that you had through all of that. And I guess what the part of the mission here is to help people become aware of their own vulnerability to that pathway and help people off that pathway at the right time. And the other part I just want to mention with you, because this is the second time I've heard you speak about your life, and it's very impactful. It's very strong where you are now, but it hasn't been all the way. But we want to remove the shame of being neurodivergent, because if we keep it as an under the carpet thing, I can't and won't talk about it, people are never going to be able to tackle their vulnerability as strongly as you now can. And we need to get that.
I would love that. I would say one other thing. I think the luckiest break in my life was meeting my wife, Helen, who has, lived with a partner that has ADHD. And we didn't know about that at the start. And, if you know my wife, she's a saint. I would say this. I always think of addiction. I first started thinking of it in terms of addiction. As you can tell, I like visuals and mental models. And if you drop a pebble in a calm pond, the ripples that come out represent the people. The pebble is the addict or
the individual.
Those ripples that are coming out are partners, wives, husbands, partners, kids, business partners, people, parents that are closely associated with that. And if you drop a pebble in this pond, you've got overlapping concentric circles. Stand back and look at that picture and imagine that on a national scale. There's probably, I'm not a statistician, but we are all in some way, shape or form connected to people that have got this neurodivergent behavior, even if we're not. And I think, you'd need to talk to my wife but she would talk about, my talking to me and I'm just not listening, and in her mind, but my mind is, Radio Simon is on at any given point, and there's a million things and compulsive lateral thinking going on, which in a relationship can be difficult, harnessed into your work. That's where this thought leads to that thought, which leads to this thought, and then you're hyper focused.
But you've got to bring that home, haven't you?
But you're a nightmare to live with. And I think part of the awareness of neurodivergent is letting the people that, because I'd like to think understanding for them leads to some peace and some
really good point.
Really
good point.
Yeah, and you said a moment ago, the ADHD. You don't see it as an excuse for some of those behaviours. You don't want other people to see it as an excuse. And the bandwagon, my word, not yours, of other people that can be jumping into this cash cow that we have at the moment with raised awareness. I concur absolutely with that. The one thing I always said when I was a police officer dealing with ADHD was, it isn't an excuse for errant behaviour. It can't be, because we have a criminal code. It can't be an excuse for it, but it can give us understanding. And if we can harness that understanding, and if rehabilitation is built around understanding as opposed to just straight penal punishment, we can actually start to change the trajectory. So if, for instance, if somebody's locked up and they're screened for ADHD, and then we find they have got ADHD, I strongly believe that when we go to court to represent what's gone on, we should be talking about what's got us to this stage in their life and how we can change that trajectory for that person with an intervention set that is not about throwing them in a room, taking the keys out and saying, get on with it for 3 years or whatever. We can do better for people in terms of you're on the wings of these amazingly Victorian ways of thinking about things. And you're right, the prison officers, the drugs officers, and
doing
those
the best they can.
Yeah, and with a system that is perhaps not respecting what we're talking about. And I think there's a future conversation I'd like to have with you about how can my world of being a massive ADHD service provider in the UK, how can we try and change that system that is very, very broken, harnessing some of those amazing individuals and giving them the empowerment to actually make the difference they want to have. A lot of my nursing staff worked in the secure estate, and they're now having a bigger impact outside the secure estate. But imagine if we can just get back in and do something.
It's game changing.
It is. So I'm working with Lord Carlisle from the House of Lords, preparing a business case for him to take to the Justice Minister, to John Simpson, to actually say, look, there's a different way of looking at this. And I'm strongly inviting you to be part of that.
The synergy, because I knew you both separately, and I think the alignment there is amazing. And then there's the education piece.
Absolutely.
You were clearly probably not conforming at school. If you were playing on the railway lines, who knows what you do at school, or not even there, right? Sure. I can identify with that. There are countless people that we know collectively that have been very successful, that can look back on school years as really difficult, misunderstood, not fitting within the lines, getting detentions and so on. But actually super bright.
Yeah.
Worked out how to harness the superpower to then
But if they're in Pentonville or the Scrubs, it's gone wrong somewhere, hasn't it? It didn't go so wrong for you. It did go wrong, but not in that direction. And you had
been a lot worse.
You had the roll of the dice to some degree,
did,
where a lot of people haven't. Imagine if we came further upstream and we're trying to work at the point where they're falling into the water as opposed to when they're drowning.
Yeah.
If we can get further back up, and this is so doable.
Yeah,
it really is so doable.
I concur
And
wholeheartedly.
there's billions of annual spend to be saved here in the justice system by just having a slightly different healthcare system. That's all we need to do. I say all because I fervently believe that's all we've got to do. And you're doing some tremendous work, and you're an inspirational man without a shadow of a doubt.
Oh.
I look forward to the next chapter of our relationship, which I think this is.
Well, it's beyond this conversation, isn't it?
Well,
the
well
awareness, the relatability, the education piece that goes with this. For me,
imagine you and me sitting down with the prisons minister or the justice minister and having this powerful conversation, which is we need to send them this
100%.
And having that conversation to say, look, we can make a difference. And maybe it will be the private sector that pump primes this to make the difference. You know, all these entrepreneurs we talk about, all these guys who are pumping money into this, that, and the other. What I've always said, what about going on Dragon's Den? But I've used this figuratively, saying, I don't want your cash, I want your influence to make a difference, because we can make a difference if we get influence. And at the moment, if we just repeat the same exercise in the justice system, in the education system, all we're doing is just carrying on with all those guys. Their kids will be where those guys are. We've got to break that chain somehow. I'm a bit emotive about it, and I apologise for that, but I think we can make a difference. And someone who's got that story, I just think there's something there. I'm so full of admiration.
Bring creativity to it as well.
Absolutely.
Put some money behind it, and you put the genius mind with the desire to make a change, which sums you up.
I can show you lads that I've met in the prison who are, one in particular, who have stayed connected to, amazing artist, incredibly, way better than me in terms of expression and visualization, but was dealt a set of cards as you and circumstances where he had no hope, he had no choice. I also find that honesty, by which I mean the ability to confront, to be ruthlessly self-honest, is a prerequisite of any 12-step. There's no point if you're lying to yourself, which we're really good at doing that in the darker period.
There was a validation part of your journey that allowed you to get to there.
That's right. Yeah.
And if we provide that for people, then we can help them with that. And when you talked about your ADHD diagnosis, lights coming on, bulbs going, and the word I see a lot of
clouds parting.
Absolutely. There's a validation of why it's been so bloody difficult to get to where I am. And with that validation, the next step is understanding. And then the honesty comes from there. And we can do that. We're doing that for 1,800 people this month. 1,800 new people will be assessed for ADHD by my company this month.
Really?
And some of those will be replicating your previous life. And we can turn that round.
Oh, well done, mate.
Well, we're on a journey, aren't we? And what John's allowing us to do. John's allowing us to raise the profile with people like yourselves. It's exciting. And what we've got to do is make sure we harness this momentum, haven't we?
100%. Mission aligned.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Simon.
Absolute pleasure to talk to you, Simon. I genuinely look forward to the next chapter of our work together.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You're a super guy.
Oh, bless you. Thanks. I'll ask my wife about that.
I will.
Yeah.
I will.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
With you, mate.
Cheers.
Thank you.